What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you the recurring characters that I hope we get some sort of glimpse of in the upcoming Divinity game. As somebody who used to be a Divinity lore channel, I was naturally very excited when that game was announced, and so I have been spending my time since then sort of kicking around some theories in my head, stuff like that, and I thought a fun way to approach that might just be to talk about some of the notable characters throughout the series and what they could do to be seen in this new game, which does require a few qualifiers. If you happen to have missed it, we have some information that helps making something like this a bit easier. You see, it was confirmed that this new game will take place about 100 years after Divinity Original Sin 2, and what's more, the game will not be a reboot of the franchise, meaning that there are going to be some established things we can work from and sort of establish a baseline with. Now, that's not to say there won't necessarily be some retcons. We also know that they've just straight up hired a team whose job it is to solidify the lore of the Divinity universe formally, as opposed to relying on dedicated fans to come up with through lines between contradictory things in the games themselves. So while we can do some educated guessing here, there is certainly still some room for change, even if it's not a reboot. Next up, before we dive fully in here, spoilers, obviously going to be some in here. Hard to talk about these characters and why they would be showing up in a later game, while completely avoiding what their stories and things are about, and so spoilers are kind of a given for this video for pretty much all of the Divinity games to some degree. Otherwise, we're going to start off with characters I think there's a high probability we could see, sort of medium chances after that. We're going to talk about the origin characters for Original Sin 2, and then lastly characters that I don't think will show up, but is certainly not impossible either. But let's talk about the characters that I think are highly likely to show up. This is largely down to the fact that this new game will take place the farthest along the timeline. If it's not a reboot, that means Divinity 2, the Dragon Knight saga, happens in between Divinity Original Sin 2 and this new game. That means that there are some things we could take from that game that are probably going to be true, alongside the likely ending of Divinity Original Sin 2 as well, to conclude that Lucian and Damien, his adopted son, are almost certainly going to be in the game in some capacity. Lucian is sort of the central figure of the series to some degree at this point, though not necessarily a good guy himself. You play as Lucian, though not known at the time, in the original game, Divine Divinity. That's the story of how he became the Divine, a godlike avatar of all of the gods. However, being a mortal man, he used that power to get up to some nefarious deeds that have only ever led the world down a darker path, some of which involves his adopted son Damien, who is in fact the avatar of Chaos, the 8th god that was sealed away by the other 7 deities after he turned on them with his demons. Trying to re-enter the world, he used Damien as a potential avatar, and then there's been back and forth with them throughout the series. Given the nature of the trailer for the upcoming game and everything, these two being in there and getting down to the bottom of what will hopefully be at least some sort of narrative conclusion to their roughly 130-ish year spat at that point. I would honestly be more surprised if these two were not in the game, to some degree. Now that does also mean we might actually get a more formal look at Chaos, the 8th god. Chaos, the god of demons, is definitely mentioned in a lot of the games, but he's not a direct influence because of the nature of him being sealed away in Hell, otherwise known as Tartarus. If they go down that route, it seems almost certain that he would show up in some capacity as well. But then there is the God King. The God King is, I would say, kind of sort of the main antagonist of Divinity Original Sin 2, and he does not die at the end of that game, but rather he is sealed outside of the realm of Rivellon, or the world that people actually live in. He is also a supremely powerful being that rivaled the gods, because the gods themselves were from the race of Eternals that the God King is the God King of, and to say he would take kindly to that banishment is unlikely, but I think where you take that from there and the theories about what he's been up to in the 100 years since are where it gets interesting. Given that both he and Chaos are in fact exiled from the realm, so to speak, it's not implausible that they could have potentially teamed up. However, that's a little unlikely as well, because the Eternals and the gods hate each other, because the gods became gods by betraying the Eternals, so the God King and Chaos wouldn't exactly get along. unless they just make it a pure enemy of my enemy situation, but even then they would be vying for power at the end of the day, so theories abound, I guess. That brings us to perhaps probably the more interesting portion of this list, which are the big ol' maybes. These are characters that I think certainly could show up, but they also don't really have to, they aren't really necessary per se, and a lot of these characters fall into the category of people who could have easily survived the 100 years between Original Sin 2 and this new title. And while there are plenty of people who without the ability to elongate their lifespan will definitely not have made it, but for the race of wizards in universe that seems to be a relatively trivial task, as the youngest of them appear to only be like 1,000 years old, which bears some explaining, I suppose. Very quickly, there are generally considered 7 races of like the main bits of civilization to some degree or another. The odd duck of those 7 races has always been the wizards. They belong to all sorts of other races, but through some means they have become wizards of no small renown, and this isn't just simple spell casting, but rather something sort of intentionally left vague that quantifies them as some different sort of being. There are not a lot of them, they've fought wars with each other at one point, but the ones that are left are truly powerful and not generally to be trifled with, though still very much mortal. Which brings us to Arhu and Zandalore. Arhu is a particularly interesting character because he's not technically human, though he is a wizard. He has the form of a human, and that's usually what he does is talking to people in. Arhu actually started his life as a cat who, through various use of magic and sorcery, was turned into a man by Cassandra, the sister of Brachus Rex, who we'll get to in a moment. Arhu has lived a very long life. We first see him, chronologically speaking, in Divinity Original Sin 1, where he is seen to be relatively young-ish, and even then, he's been alive for a while, because the events with Brachus Rex and his sister that turned Arhu into a man happened an extremely long time ago by the time that game rolls around, and then he survives another 1,250 or so years in between Original Sin 1 and Original Sin 2, because he's in Original Sin 2, where he seems to have still been loyal to the divine at that point, and so I think it's highly likely they could carry forth Arhu, as he and Zandalore are kind of central figures to the series as well. Which brings us to Zandalore. Zandalore is kind of like this universe's Gandalf. His main purpose seems to be facilitating the character into the main plot, though his youthful escapades were on full display in Divinity Original Sin 1, as his relationship with 2 witches he was training did a not insubstantial amount of the work of setting the events of the first game into motion. Having hopefully learned from his youthful folly, he does appear in the later games as a much more wizened old sage type who's really more about trying to save the world and having clearly learned some things along the way. And so he is in Divinity Original Sin 1, Divine Divinity. He is mentioned in Beyond Divinity, but is not technically speaking in that game, but the situation there is a little weird and it's hard to explain. At least quickly, that is. And he even shows up in Divinity 2, the Dragon Knight saga, plays a pretty central role there, and so I think it is highly likely that he would have survived into this new game as well. So, much like Arhu, certainly possible we will see him around. Then there is Belegar. Belegar is admittedly more of a joke character, but he is also a wizard who is there primarily as comedic relief, though he does play a slightly more important role in the Dragon Knight saga. But given his longevity and comedic relief, I would say he'll almost certainly have some sort of small appearance in this new game, which should be funny if nothing else. And then of course there's Malady, a bit of an enigma from Divinity Original Sin 2. This woman is a half-demon, half-elf. She does a significant amount of work into helping the character in Divinity Original Sin 2 purely for her own ends. That is made abundantly clear. But why is she in the maybe list? She very clearly has like this big intrigue at the heart of her backstory. Her half-demon status is never properly explained. Well, the maybe is it kind of depends on what they choose to take as canon from Original Sin 2, because there is an ending where Malady dies, but it's very hard to get. In fact, you'd almost have to be intentionally messing everything up to make it happen. That's how difficult it is to get naturally, but it is theoretically not impossible that they would do that. However, given her status as a sort of fan favorite from that game, I think that is unlikely to happen. I think if she's not in this new game, it would likely be down to more them not wanting to spoil the mystery that is her character and leave some mystique there. But given that she was supposed to be in that cancelled game Fallen Heroes, and her status as a half-demon in this new game having to do with demonic forces, it seems like she'll play some sort of role. Next up, Brachus Rex himself. Brachus Rex is an interesting character because people who play Original Original Sin 1 and Original Sin 2 know that he is present in both of those games and causes a bit of a fuss by getting resurrected constantly. However, the catch is, his role in the series tends to be a bit overblown. I think he's a useful villain who's just a purely evil bad guy. But the height of his power was before Divinity Original Sin 1, where he makes his first appearance, and then he's already died and been resurrected by that point, and then he dies and gets resurrected again for Divinity Original Sin 2. And while he's very knowledgeable about sorcery and the like, he's never really been shown to have any greater motive than trying to dominate everyone, which is why it's a convenient reason to keep bringing him back. But I don't know that they would bother to make him any more important in this new game, other than maybe he gets resurrected and killed again, I guess. But I can't deny the possibility that the guy does seem to be easily resurrectable, and so here we are. Then, before we start talking about origin characters, we've got Jahan, one of my personal favorite characters across gaming. The guy who gave me my sign-off and everything. Jahan was a companion in Original Sin 1, and he's a big part of Original Sin 2 if you go through Losa's storyline especially. He is a demonologist, blessed or cursed, depending on how you look at it, with immortality. He could have easily survived to see this next game. His backstory is told to you in Original Sin 1 by simply being what his companion story is, really. Basically, he was tricked by a demon who began siphoning his life unbeknownst to him, and through all sorts of esoteric and arcane research, he figures out about it, makes a deal with a different demon that gives him 1,000 years of guaranteed life, in exchange for his soul as per the usual. But in all his research and the 1,000 years after that point, he has learned something. Basically, if you kill a demon, the effects of their ongoing deals just become permanent. And so, when you kill that demon in Original Sin 1, Jahan's immortality became permanent. The game does make it seem like he can be killed physically, but like in terms of age, it's not going to happen. He will live in perpetuity outside of extenuating circumstances. And so, given, again, the demonic nature, it would seem, of this upcoming game, Jahan seems like a very easy character to bring forward there. Also, he's awesome, so there's that. Now let's talk a little bit about the origin characters. This is interesting because whether or not they would even want to bring these characters into the game and, like, you know, mess around with what they've established in the previous game and what they want to canonicize, etc. It's a tricky subject. I can't possibly know all of those things or what they're thinking over at Larian is, so truly, who knows what they do with these characters. But I will say, of the 6 of them, Losa, Beast, and Ifin are probably the most difficult ones to bring forward, because Losa and Ifin, being humans, should theoretically be dead by the time the next game rolls around just from old age, outside of them finding a way to extend their life, which, depending on the ending that they decide to canonicize, though Source being purged looking like the most likely, means that has become more difficult. I also don't get the impression that Ifin is the type of person who would want to live forever. Losa also seems to revel in her own humanity, and so while it wouldn't be impossible to bring them forward, I just don't see it happening. Then you've got Beast. As far as I'm aware, I'm pretty sure Beast was the least popular of the origin characters, and so, I mean, just from that standpoint, I don't think they would bring him forward. But like the others, can't deny that it's possible. The other 3 are more interesting due to their lore implications, however, starting with Sabeel. Sabeel basically gives you a look at the culture and nature of the elves in the Divinity universe through Original Sin 2. And I do want to point out that the vast majority of lore for the elves was added by Original Sin 2. They had very little lore before that game. It was there, of course, but most of it was added by Original Sin 2. And depending on how you deal with Sabeel and her personal story, it has very large implications for the elves going forward. So depending on what they go with there, though one certainly does seem a bit more likely than the others, I think Sabeel will wind up having an effect on all of the elves, even if she is not seen personally in the next game, though she should theoretically be able to live long enough to see it either way. Then you've got the Red Prince. The Red Prince may or may not survive to the second game, sure, but again, with his personal story also has huge implications for the lore of the universe and how the lizards relate to dragons, or pseudo-dragons, perhaps might be the way to put it, because dragons in this universe are their own dedicated sort of creator race, as they're often referred to, whereas the dragons that the lizards descended from seem to be different and related to the lizard god Zoroastissa, who at one time had a dragon-like appearance, but it's thought to be separate than the race of dragons. And all told, personally, I know a lot of people love the Red Prince, but I don't care if he's in the next game, but they will simply have to address the lore of his personal story in some way, but I think, truth be told, what I just told you is likely how they would do it, and the sort of pseudo-dragon race that hails from Zoroastissa will probably be at the heart of whatever they choose to do there, but it's a bit of lore that does need to be clarified, and as I mentioned, they've hired that team whose job it is to do that, so theoretically they would probably handle this. And then last but not least, we have Fane, the Eternal, and potentially his daughter Dallas. Or the woman pretending to be Dallas, I should say. We don't actually catch her full name, I don't think, as I recall. But Fane was the person that discovered the veil that allowed the gods to take power and betray the rest of the Eternals, and so he plays a pretty big part in Original Sin 2, where he sort of faces off with the God King. Being an Eternal, who's, as the name would imply, has an extremely long life, could, again, easily live to the point at which we could see this next game. To be completely honest with you, I kind of feel like his story is just sort of done, and while I'm sure other people will feel differently, I personally kind of think it would do a disservice to his story to continue it further. I think, honestly, I would prefer to just see him be left alone and go about doing whatever is left of his life, I suppose. But that then brings us to the sort of unlikely section. Characters I don't think are likely to show up, but potentially could. They could do something with some of these guys, as they are relatively important figures that aren't dead, actually. Or at least are potentially not dead anyway, as there is some leeway there. One of them is super fun. I'm going to save that one for last. But first, let's start with Maxos. Now, I told you all about wizards earlier. Maxos is like Wizard Supreme. The guy was the head wizard in charge. He only appears in one game, Dragon Commander, and he is mentioned in several others. But the catch is, he disappeared. He found a portal to what is essentially the afterlife, known as the Hall of Echoes, that he entered in order to hopefully learn more about dragons, which he studies constantly as he knows that they are the creator race. He was a bit obsessed with them. And so he disappeared somewhere in the desert of Youthful Gore and hasn't been heard from since. And if you're bringing this new game forward, I don't think it's inconceivable that they could suddenly bring him back as a lore point and build upon where he has been, what he's been learning, what he's been up to, etc., etc. That's certainly an option for them. At the very least, given his status as an extremely powerful spellcaster, he could prove either a helpful ally or a difficult enemy, depending on how it comes out. Next up, we've got Patriarch the Black. Patriarch is a true-blooded full dragon of the old creator race, and as his name would imply, is quite old. In fact, Patriarch is the one that told Maxos about how to enter the Hall of Echoes. Patriarch tells you in Divinity 2, in fact, that he has to be careful about the things he says because speaking words in his own tongue can just spring things into existence. True dragons are rare, and truth be told, we don't really have anything to compare their power to, and for exactly that reason, I feel like if Patriarch is in this new game, they would only keep it extremely brief. Due to the nature of their very being, they seem relatively disinterested in everybody's affairs but their own, but also Patriarch's cool as hell, so there's that. Next up, we've got a nice fun one with the Orc Croxy. You see, as we saw from the trailer and things with this upcoming game, it seems likely that they're going to try to bring the orcs in as potentially a playable race, or at least a much bigger focus here. You see, orcs have been in the previous games, yes, however, they've always played much more of an antagonistic role, and while you could talk to them here and there, they were mostly seen as and acted like barbarians and savages, etc. However, they are, again, capable of speech. They are not complete imbeciles or anything like that. They've got a brain and they know how to use it, and that's where Croxy comes in. You see, in Divine Divinity, your main goal in that game as Lucian is to round up the Council of Seven, representatives of each race that are meant to represent their deity, whether they knew about it or not. Croxy is the representative of the orcs. Croxy realized that they were in fact being manipulated by the Black Ring in that game and was imprisoned as a result of this discovery, so he couldn't spread knowledge about it to the other orcs. Towards the end of that game, most of the Council of Seven dies, with one exception, Croxy. Croxy lives. As far as we know, they don't die in the subsequent portion of the game where Lucian attacks the sort of hideout of the Black Ring, and so with them bringing the orcs into prominence in this next game, or at least potentially doing so, I don't see any reason why they couldn't, if they wanted to, bring Croxy in as a sort of established orc character that you've had just straight up dealings with and is very capable of more, let's say, helpful attitudes than just attacking you, while also still being a seasoned warrior himself. I could easily see them bringing him in as a leader of some sort if that is what they wanted to do. Given that that is also an extremely niche reference to a character that nobody has seen in decades, I also don't think it would matter if they skipped it, but I do think it would be fun if they brought him in. And then last but not least, to be very blunt with you, I think this is incredibly unlikely, but it was a fun little theory I had thought up, and I thought, why not mention it in a video like this? And I think a recurring character they could bring back if they wanted to is none other than the archdemon Andromeda, the central antagonist of Losa's story, and honestly most likely canonically dead. There is a situation in which they could bring this character back and also tie it directly into this upcoming title. It would require a little bit of stretching here and there, and again, this character is almost certainly dead, and I think the bad outcome that this would cause would be such an uproar that I don't know that they would want to do that. But basically, there is an ending to Divinity Original Sin 2 where instead of killing this guy, you instead make a deal to share the power of divinity with him, which is exactly what he wants. Giving an archdemon exactly what he wants is probably not a good idea, and if you decide to go through with it in spite of that common knowledge, Andromeda uses his newfound power of divinity to become what is known as the Demon Divine, eventually pushing your side of divinity out, and over time, giving you one of the worst possible outcomes for Original Sin 2, given that the world eventually succumbs to the powers of demons. And if any of that sounds familiar, because we may sort of see that in the trailer itself for the next game, that is to say, clearly some sort of demonic influence happening, who's to say if the canon of this upcoming new game is not in fact that the Demon Divine somehow orchestrated all of this? Now this is exceptionally unlikely, truth be told, just because in order to make this happen, Lucian would theoretically need to have died, but we know that he is alive in the Dragon Knight saga in 2, and without extensive rewrites that I don't necessarily think would be the best idea, this seems highly implausible, and hence why it's in the most unlikely of the recurring characters section. But I am not unconvinced that you could not write your way around this and find a way to shoehorn this in. And so while, again, extremely unlikely, there is something about games taking the worst possible ending as the canon one that honestly just makes me laugh a lot, and so I wanted to throw it on here for fun. And I think that is where we're going to wrap up this particular video of potential recurring characters in the upcoming Divinity title. These are all the characters I thought about that could be potentially interesting to see, but I'm sure at least some of you may well have your own thoughts or interests about this exact subject, and if there's some character that you want to see in this upcoming game or potential theories you've got, by all means throw them down in the comment section below. I am all ears. But as for today, that is pretty much going to do it. So if you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.